Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. This is a series on the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. And today we continue with events in Russia right after the Bolsheviks took power. So this is about the Lenin in power, or Bolsheviks in power, or Communist Russia. There are all kinds of titles, but the events will follow in great detail right after the Bolsheviks seized control of Petrograd in November 1917. Now, usually when we speak about Bolsheviks in power, we assume that there is a government, that the Bolshevik government does this and does that. They have a policy, they introduce something that some people call war communism. What I'll try to show today that this is not so. There was hardly any government at all. But let's just go one thing at a time. So when the Bolsheviks did seize control of Petrograd, it's important to understand it was just Petrograd. There was nothing else. It took them about a week of street fighting in Moscow to establish control over Moscow. But even then, it was just only Moscow and Petrograd. Nowhere else did they have any power. And this explains why a week later, in the middle of November, old style, the end of November, new style of calendar, the elections to the Constituent Assembly did take place. And I'll come back to the detailed analysis of the results of the elections to the Constituent Assembly later. But now let me just focus on two sides of Bolsheviks in power. One side is the official acts of the government and what Lenin is trying to do, the public persona, so to speak. And then we will see what was actually going on in Petrograd and in other big cities in these first few weeks. That is to say, the end of November, December 1917, early 1918. So Lenin, of course, is very popular among those who follow his official policies. I can't resist telling you a story. When I was in Germany studying in a university, and we had a seminar on the Russian Revolution, and there were enthusiastic young Germans who were saying Lenin is so great. And I asked him, why do you think he's so great? And he told me, this student, because he was for peace, because he was the only one who dared to challenge the establishment of the world powers and to proclaim a decree on peace. This is something that Lenin did in December 1917. Now, we'll come back to that too. Of course, there was no peace, but it was a very effective declaration. The Allies refused to go, and the Germans did sign up for it, and they started peace negotiations, which in the end led to Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, which of course was that Russia gave away to German demands, basically signed anything that they demanded, and it was at the loss of the Baltic provinces of the empire and Belarus and Ukraine. Huge territories that were actually much, much bigger than where the position of the front line was. It was a total capitulation to German demands. That was the case of so-called decree on peace. Then I can't resist another example when there was a French communist, a good friend of mine, and when we discussed the Bolsheviks, he actually really believed that what happened in Russia in November 1917 is that the proletariat, the working classes, came to power. He did believe that this was a land of victorious proletariat, that this was a land where workers and peasants were in the government. Now, of course, this is all, sorry to say, it's nonsense. There were no workers and peasants in the government, and it was not a proletariat revolution that gave much to the workers. So what was it then? The best way to understand the Bolshevik government is to go beyond their official propaganda claims. And these were three. There was a decree on peace, which I have just discussed, that led to capitulation at Brest-Litovsk. There was a decree on land, which proclaimed that all land belongs to the people, but it didn't specify who is going to get what land. In reality, The decree on land, it was nothing but propaganda statement, because it was not a law. It was not elaborated in great detail as the SRs were intending to do, who was going to get what kind of land, with compensation, without compensation. It was really, the Bolshevik decree of land is a propaganda statement that all the land belongs to the people. In reality, it turned out to essentially putting a blind eye or recognizing the seizures of land by force. Those who could, and that is to say, is free for all. Essentially, we have, pictures of peasants destroying landlords' estates and robbing their, taking out furniture and pianos and all kinds of things, essentially dividing up the landlord's estate. Whoever could do it, who was the strongest, was the one who would get the most. Sometimes it was divided by the community, the peasant commune. Sometimes it was simply a chaotic destruction of property. That's what the so-called decree on land did. A decree on land, decree on peace. And then, of course, there was this promise of bread. Of course, the situation with bread supply got even worse, simply because the Bolsheviks seized the banks. So this is another one of the first things. Officially, it was declared as nationalization of banks. But when you look at it more attentively, it was not a nationalization. Nationalization would mean that that banks go under some kind of a different management, that they continue to be banks, which means they do financial operations, that people have their accounts, that accounts are paid from one enterprise to another. All of that ceased. Essentially, the best way to describe the Bolshevik nationalization of banks is seizure of banks, or simply bank robbery, because banks stopped being banks. The Bolsheviks simply came there with their detachment of workers and special units that was going to be their Cheka strike force, and robbed it. I mean, literally took away the valuables and the money and whatever assets there were in the banks, and they no longer worked as banks, because the currency under the Tsar's currency and the provisional government was abolished, and their own currency has not yet been created. And when it was created, nobody wanted to use it, and the Tsarist money continued to go into circulation. In other words, Bolshevik destroyed the banking system by so-called nationalizing it, in fact robbing it of its assets, and that was a huge blow to the industry and to the workers, which were supposedly the beneficiaries of this new government of supposedly workers and peasants. A few words about some other actions, and then we will go to the discussion of what it actually meant. One other outward action was the creation of a Bolshevik government in coalition with the left SRs. That was an important event in the sense that the Bolsheviks succeeded in breaking the SR party and presenting themselves to the public as a multi-party government, which of course was a very, very clever ploy, because as we know from later events, the left SRs did not have any real power. They were kept there for a few months as a decoy to split the SR party, and then they were dumped in another illegal coup d'etat that the Bolsheviks staged in July 1918, but I'll talk about it much later. Let me focus now on what exactly was Bolshevism as a phenomenon, as a state of mind, as a reality of Russia in the end of 1917, which is often forgotten. First of all, I claim that it was not a government. The governments have policy, the government have departments, and they try to do something. The only thing the Bolsheviks tried to do was seize as much as possible into their own hands. They acted like a terrorist party that seized control and was trying to grab as much as possible in as little as possible a time, because they were not sure at all that they would be able to exist for more than a few months. So it was seizure of property, and the most important aspect of it, and that is familiar to Russians who lived through the 1990s, and that is the greatest redivision of property ever done at any time in any country. This was the time when anybody could seize anything. In other words, the factory committees were seizing factories and dividing up the management if they could manage it. Most of the time they couldn't manage it, and the factories would come to a standstill. Moreover, the owners would run away. The banks would not supply the loans or the financial services of any kind, so the production would halt. With this, the winter of 1917-1918 was a winter of terrible unemployment, which started rising because of the Bolshevik policies and so-called nationalization of the banks. But the most important thing, the seizure of factories led to the factory committees proclaiming themselves in control, but they could not run the production. They could not organize production. They were totally helpless because all they could do is pass resolutions, but the factories came to a standstill. Moreover, the workers perceived their victory of the proletarian revolution in a way that they don't have to work anymore. Nobody wanted to work anymore, and the dictatorship of the proletariat turned out, in fact, to the scenes where they would force the overthrown bourgeoisie to work. And we have pictures of, guards, red guards in red bands standing over and forcing, the priests and other aristocratic ladies and others to do some menial work. This is how the Bolsheviks could gain their cheap popularity, by showing outwardly that the overthrown classes are now forced to work. Now, another example of this expropriation of property, seizure of the banks, the personal accounts were of course seized as well, was a campaign to redivide living quarters. So if you're an engineer and you lived under the old regime in an apartment of 5 rooms, a living room, dining room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a little room for the cook or some maid, well, now the committee would come and would say this is going to be a communal apartment, and you're lucky if out of the 5 rooms you're going to have 1, and then 5 other rooms in your apartment would be given to the proletariat, which would be pretty much to most active Bolsheviks and communists and other commissars, and maybe to some of you elite workers who would move to these quarters. So there was a kind of a redivision, outward manifestation that those who had nothing now will have all the benefits, and those who did have benefits will have nothing. You would have scenes when factory committees would be given the best seats in the theaters for all kinds of shows, and they would be sitting in the lodge for the Tsar and enjoying the show. So it was redivision of property meant, of course, that property lost any value. Money lost any value. People were impoverished, just like in the 1990s. People lost everything. And then a few months later, they would try to sell whatever they could, just like in the 1990s. There would be aristocratic ladies staying on the corners trying to sell a bracelet or this or that or a piece of furniture to buy some food, which was astronomically expensive. And of course, everything was presented as this kind of a justice that finally came to the ruling classes of Russia. There was no police, there was no law and order, there was a lot of rape, a lot of theft, a lot of gangs would burst into the apartment of the bourgeoisie and take as much from it as possible. It was a pretty tough time. Those of you who believe that there is certain civility or certain kind of a government that enforces some kind of a law, that they have some kind of policy, that there is law and order, we should understand there was nothing like this. Bolshevism in the early 1918, late 1917 is chaos. It's chaos deliberately ignited by the Bolsheviks to provide for themselves money, resources, and popularity of the lowest of the low, those who have absolutely nothing, and would gain and support the regime in the sense that they could smash those who had something, the pre-existing ruling classes, or those people of property, even they had nothing to do with the bourgeoisie, the professional people, the engineers, doctors, professors, they were deliberately humiliated. They were deliberately abused. Their property, their apartments, their bank accounts were seized. This is how Bolshevism was in reality in the early 1918. It is collapse of the state. It is collapse of authority. It is rise of gangs and criminal activity of all kinds that essentially characterizes these few months. And on that, I will end this segment. Please tell all your friends to subscribe, and there will be many more in great detail coming up videos on the development of the Bolshevik rule, the war communism, and the civil war that followed. Thank you.